the US has announced it will impose new mandatory COVID-19 testing for all travellers from China after the decision by Beijing to lift its stringent zero COVID policies. Well, America has joined Italy, India, Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia and Japan now in announcing the new measures following the huge increase in infections across China. But the UK government has confirmed today it has no plans to introduce similar restrictions for those travelling from China. Well, let's speak now to the former head of health analysis at the ONS, Jamie Jenkins, who joins us. Jamie, thank you very much indeed for your time. Is that the right decision?
Well, I think obviously, Mark, the UK government was criticised very early on in the pandemic. Almost going back 3 years now for not having kind of restrictions at the borders when we saw the first kind of wave of what we would see with COVID. But the UK is not an outlier, I suppose. You've got the Australian government as well coming out saying they're not planning on introducing any kind of restrictions on travellers from China. Their chief medical officer down there has actually cited that there's high levels of immunity across the population. Obviously, we've had a lot of infections here in the UK as well. We've had a vaccination program. So the current variants that are circulating across China are no different to the ones that we've got here. So I think the UK government's in line with some other countries. But remember, the US government that have kind of brought this in as well, they do still have some travel restrictions for kind of non-US citizens anyway. If you haven't had 2 vaccinations, you can't enter the USA as well at the moment. So I think that different countries are taking a different approach, but the UK is not an outlier by saying they're not.
Yeah, Italy has gone the other way, testing all passengers arriving from China for any type of COVID. And Lord Bethell, the former health minister, saying perhaps that is the right way forward, the precautionary principle, in case there are new mutations coming through from abroad.
Well, they'll be obviously, we do kind of have some surveillance in the population anyway, so we'll identify if there's any mutations that are going on there, and other countries will pick up as well. Some would argue, should there be a burden on the UK in terms of doing this testing? Maybe a more pragmatic approach is for everybody who's leaving China. Remember, we had to have proof of negative tests to leave the United Kingdom to go travelling anywhere. So rather than countries themselves having to actually test, the requirement for testing as people arrive, maybe there should be more of a requirement for testing as people leave. And, things are getting quite bad in China at the moment. If you look at kind of, it's difficult to ascertain exactly what's happening on the ground because it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on. But, I wouldn't trust the stats that are coming out of China. That's the one thing.
But isn't that the very problem, that we don't know what's going on there, what sort of variants of COVID are rampant now, as some reports suggest, and therefore what would happen if that was released from China and into the rest of the world?
Well, that's one of the things that we will pick up quite early, obviously, from countries like the US. The UK will get criticised if something does happen quite broadly across the board here. But obviously the UK government would argue we're trying to go into that living with COVID phase. So we remember the UK is currently in its own mini wave of COVID, and COVID cases are rising across other nations. We're in that kind of winter respiratory virus season at the moment. So I think the UK government would argue that we're trying to live with COVID. We want to reduce these restrictions on people's lives that have gone in there. But you could make the equal argument, people haven't left China for a while. They've had these stringent lockdowns. But I suppose we will find out if there are any issues, because if tests are being done for other countries, we'll pick up from there. The criticism would be obviously if something did happen, why we didn't bring it in the UK.